My daughter demanded $50,000. Her husband's next words changed everything overnight. I want you to picture this. A Tuesday evening, meatloaf in the oven, and my own daughter sitting across my kitchen table telling me I owed her $50,000. Not asking. Telling me. And when I said no, her husband opened his mouth and said 11 words that ended their marriage, their scheme, and any claim they thought they had on my life. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you'll understand exactly how a 73-year-old woman in a housecoat and slippers took back everything that was hers. Before I go further, if you enjoy stories like mine, please hit that like button and subscribe. It truly means the world to an old woman with too much time and too many memories. And I'd love to know in the comments below what city or country you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and it warms my heart to know how far these words travel. My name is Patricia. I'm 73 years old, and I've buried a husband, raised 2 children mostly alone for the last third of my marriage, and spent 41 years working as a school administrator before I finally retired. I tell you this not to make you feel sorry for me, but so you understand something important. I did not get to 73 years old in my own paid-off house with money in the bank by being foolish. Whatever foolishness happened later, know that it did not come from me. My daughter's name for this story, I'll call her by her middle name Elaine, because I don't feel like giving her the dignity of anything more personal. Elaine is 44. She's my younger child. My son lives 2 states away with his own family, and thankfully, none of this touches him. Elaine married a man 11 years ago, a man I will call Roy, and for a long time I thought Roy was a decent if unambitious sort of fellow. Steady job in logistics, quiet at holidays, always complimented my cooking. I did not know Roy at all as it turned out. Not really. The trouble started, as trouble often does, with a phone call that was too sweet to be honest. Elaine called me on a Sunday afternoon. Her voice pitched up in that particular register she uses when she wants something. She asked how I was feeling, how my knee was doing, whether I'd been getting out enough since I retired. I should have known. My daughter has never once asked about my knee, unless she wanted something bigger than a kind word. 2 days later, she and Roy showed up at my door unannounced, which they never do. Elaine came in with a folder. An actual folder, like she was presenting a business proposal to a bank. She sat at my kitchen table, opened it up, and started talking about a business opportunity. Some kind of investment in a friend's franchise, real estate flips, something involving numbers that sounded impressive and vague all at once. She needed $50,000. Not a loan exactly, she said, though she used that word loosely. More of an investment in the family's future. I want to be clear about something. I am not a wealthy woman by any grand measure, but I am a careful one. My husband and I paid off this house 22 years ago. I have a pension and modest savings that I built by not spending money I didn't need to spend, not by luck. $50,000 was not pocket change to me. It was years of discipline. I asked her the obvious questions. What business exactly? Who was this friend? What paperwork existed? What happened if the investment failed? Elaine got flustered, the way people do when they haven't actually thought through their own story, and she started talking faster, saying things like, "Mom, you always do this, you always make everything difficult, and don't you trust me?" Here's the thing about that question. Trust isn't the same as blind obedience, and at 73, I've earned the right to ask for details before I hand over a life's worth of saving. I told her I needed time to think about it, and to see actual paperwork if this was real. That's when Roy leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and said the 11 words that changed everything. He said, "She doesn't need to see anything. It's already decided." Now you might read those words and think, well, that's rude, but it's not exactly a bombshell. Let me tell you why those 11 words hit me like a slap. It's already decided. Not "we hope you'll consider it." Not "we'd appreciate your help." Decided. As though my house, my savings, my 41 years of getting up at 6 in the morning to open a school building, belonged to a committee that had met without me and voted on how to spend my life's work. I looked at my daughter's face when he said it, waiting for her to correct him, to soften it, to say something like what my husband means is. She didn't. She just looked down at her folder and picked at the edge of a page like a child caught in a lie. And that's when I understood. This wasn't Roy overstepping. This was Roy saying out loud what the two of them had already agreed to in private. I didn't yell. I want you to know that about me, I am not a yeller. I put my hands flat on the table, the way I used to when I had to discipline a room full of teenagers who thought they'd gotten away with something. And I said very calmly, I think you two should go home now. Elaine started to protest, but Roy actually stood up first, taking her by the arm, and I remember him saying, let's go, this was a waste of time, like I was the unreasonable one, like I was the problem in the room. They left. The folder stayed on my table, forgotten, and I sat there for a long while just looking at it. Here is where the story could have gone the ordinary way. I could have stewed, called my son to complain, maybe cried a little, and eventually let it go the way mothers so often do, because we're taught our whole lives to keep the peace even when the peace was never really peaceful to begin with. But I didn't feel like crying that night. I felt something colder and clearer than that. I felt like doing my homework. I opened that folder after they left. And here's where it gets interesting, because whatever Elaine and Roy expected me to do with a folder full of half-finished paperwork, they did not expect me to actually read it carefully, cross-reference names, and make some phone calls. The friend whose franchise they wanted to invest in wasn't a friend at all. It was a company registered under a name I recognized after some digging, a name connected to a man Roy had worked with years earlier at a previous job, a job he'd left under circumstances Elaine had once described to me vaguely as it just didn't work out. That should have told me something back then. It told me plenty now. I made a few calls to people I still know from my working years, people who understand paperwork and public records the way I understand lesson plans and budget reports, because 41 years in school administration teaches you a great deal about following a paper trail. What I found was that this investment had already lost money for at least 2 other people who'd been approached the same way, dressed up the same way, presented with the same kind of urgency. $50,000 was not going into some flourishing franchise. It was going to plug a hole that Roy had already dug for himself, quietly, over the past year, likely to cover debts from a previous bad decision he hadn't told my daughter about, let alone me. Now I could have simply confronted them with this information and washed my hands of the whole thing. That would have been the easy path. But I am 73 years old, I raised 2 children, I managed budgets for an entire school district, and I have never in my life believed in doing the easy thing when the right thing required a bit more patience. So I waited. I didn't call. I didn't text. I let a full week go by, and I imagined that week was uncomfortable for both of them, wondering what silence from their mother actually meant. In the meantime, I did 3 things. First, I called my lawyer, a woman I've trusted for over a decade, and I updated some paperwork of my own. I won't go into the specifics here because frankly it's nobody's business but mine, but let's just say that any assumptions certain people may have quietly been making about their future inheritance needed some serious revising, given what I just learned about their character. Second, I reached out to one of the other people I discovered through my digging, a woman roughly my age who had lost $8,000 to this same scheme 2 years prior. She was stunned that someone had actually taken the time to track her down, and even more stunned to learn the person doing the tracking was the mother-in-law of the man who'd taken her money. We talked for over an hour. She was kind, she was grateful, and by the end of that call, she'd agreed to something I asked of her, which I'll get to shortly. Third, and this is the part I'm proudest of, I called my son. Not to complain, but to loop him in, because a family matter of this size deserved more than one set of eyes, and because I trust his judgment. He was, understandably, furious on my behalf, but I asked him to let me handle it my way. He agreed reluctantly and told me to call him the moment I needed backup. A week and a half after that dinner table conversation, I invited Elaine and Roy back to my house. I told Elaine it was to discuss the investment further, and I could hear the relief in her voice, the assumption that her mother had come around, that the folder had worked its magic after all. I made a pot of coffee. I set out the good cups, the ones from my wedding china that I only use for company I actually respect, which should have been the tell right there, though neither of them noticed. They arrived at 6. I let them sit. I let Roy start talking again about timelines and returns and how quickly this money needed to move. And when he paused for breath, I set my coffee cup down and I said, before we go further, I have someone I'd like you to say hello to. I called the woman I'd spoken with, put her on speakerphone right there on my kitchen table, the same table where they told me it was already decided, and I let her introduce herself. I watched Roy's face change color in real time, watched him go from confident to gray in about 4 seconds, while this woman calmly explained who she was, how much money she'd lost, and how the man sitting in my kitchen had personally reassured her, 2 years earlier, that her investment was completely safe. Elaine went white. She turned to Roy and asked him, In a small voice I hadn't heard from her since she was a teenager caught sneaking out, whether this was true. And Roy, to his very limited credit, didn't even bother denying it. He just sat there silent, which told her everything she needed to know. I ended the call, thanked the woman again, and then I did something I'd been planning all week. I slid a folder of my own across the table, my little mirror to his, except mine had actual documentation. Copies of the public filings. A summary of the debts I'd traced back to him. And a simple, typed letter from my lawyer confirming that certain provisions in my estate planning had been revised, effective immediately, in light of new information about the character and financial conduct of certain family members. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to call anyone names. I said quite plainly I raised my daughter to be smarter than this, and I built this life so that no one could simply walk in and decide what happens to it without me. You told me it was already decided. I'm telling you now it was never yours to decide in the first place. Elaine cried. Not the manipulative kind of crying she'd sometimes done as a younger woman when she wanted her way, but the real kind, the kind that comes from realizing the person you trusted most has been lying to you for longer than you can bear to think about. I felt for her in that moment genuinely. She was a victim here too, just a different kind than the woman on the phone. Roy left that night without a word. And within 2 months, my daughter had filed for divorce. It wasn't only because of the money, as it turned out. Once she started asking real questions, she found more debts, more lies, more evidence that the man she'd married had been quietly digging a hole under their entire life for years, and my near miss with that $50,000 folder was simply the moment she was forced to see it. Elaine and I are rebuilding something now slowly, the way you rebuild anything that's been cracked but not shattered. She came to me a few weeks later without a folder this time, just herself, and apologized. Not the kind of apology that makes excuses, but the kind that simply says I was wrong, and I'm sorry I let him speak for both of us at your table. I told her I forgave her because I do, but I also told her that trust, like money, has to be earned back slowly and carefully, the same way I earned everything I have. As for Roy, I understand he's since moved out of state, and frankly, I have no further interest in tracking his story. Some people write their own endings, and his was written the moment he sat at my table and told me my life savings were already decided without me. I think about that phrase sometimes late at night with my tea when the house is quiet. It's already decided. As if a woman of 73, who has survived a husband's death, raised 2 children, run budgets for an entire school district, and paid off her own home with her own 2 hands, could ever be spoken over so easily. He decided wrong. And now, so does everyone who ever thinks an old woman sitting quietly at her own kitchen table has nothing left to fight with. If my story meant something to you tonight, please don't scroll away just yet. Take a moment to like this video and subscribe, so more stories like mine can find their way to you. And I really do want to know down in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Knowing that my little kitchen table story has traveled so far, into so many homes, means more to me than you probably realize. Take care of yourselves and take care of the people who actually deserve your trust.